Travel all over the countryside, ask the Leylands, ask the Leylands. Travel all over the countryside, ask the Leyland Brothers. Whatever it is that you want to see, ask the Leylands, ask the Leylands. No matter whatever that happens to be, ask the Leyland Brothers. Come on, me in it and join in the fun. Travel all over Australia. Ask the Leyland, ask the Leyland, ask the Leyland Brothers.
Ever heard of a boat that is propelled by a jet of water? Well, they invented them in New Zealand, and that's where we're going to go, to the South Island, to find out just what these remarkable boats can do in the upper reaches of their mountain streams.
And is the Tasmanian tiger extinct? That's what we're going to try and find out when we go down to Tasmania.
And then finally we're going to take a look at a shipwreck, the tragic shipwreck of the Loch Ard, here on the south coast of Victoria, on the rugged coastline where 50 people lost their lives. We've come to the rugged west coast of the South Island of New Zealand to answer a request from Mr. John Charker of Newcastle, New South Wales, who says when you go to New Zealand, you must experience the thrill of a lifetime by tackling one of their rapid-strewn rivers in a jet boat. So to take Mr. Charker's advice, we've contacted Eddie Scarlett in the picturesque fishing town of Westport on the Buller River, famous for its rapids. The unique part of the boat is that it's powered by the New Zealand-developed Hamilton jet, a revolutionary concept. How exactly does that work, Eddie?
Well, it drags the water in from underneath here and goes through a three-stage axial flow pump and ejects it out here at very high velocity.
So it works very similar to a jet engine on an aircraft?
Very similar, only here we're using water and not air.
Eddie frequently takes paying visitors up the Buller River, so our family, Lorraine, baby Carmen, and even Mum and Dad joined today's trip to see how remarkable this revolutionary boat really is. I've filmed many boat trips before and even tackled a few rapids, downstream in canoes and inflatable dinghies, but this will be my first trip up rapids in a powerboat. The unique propulsion system of the Hamilton jet leaves no protrusions below the water, and high-speed jet moves the boat at great speed. The jet is angled to turn the boat with absolute accuracy. Bill Hamilton developed his first jets in 1964, and 10 years later received a knighthood in recognition for his services. The Hamilton jet is able to take deep water, or only a few centimetres, in its stride. Pebbles won't suck into the jet, and it must be kept moving as it skims on a thin film of water. After some 40 kilometres, we enter the more enclosed part of the Buller Valley. Picturesque mountain country, accessible only by jet boat, or days of bushwalking. The boat's ability to skim through only a few centimetres of water gives it the unique capability of high-speed travel over rugged, boulder-strewn rapids in complete safety. These jets were the first and only boats to travel up the Colorado River in the United States of America. The list of conquered rivers is impressive and includes the Congo in Africa and the Sepik in New Guinea. Eddie tackles the really rough rapids on his own, suggesting that the danger of capsize is not worth taking with the baby. Chaka, this is about as far upstream as we can go in this particular boat. It's a fairly heavy one and we can't tackle the really hair-raising rapids in the upper reaches of the Buller River. But we tend to agree with you. The unique Hamilton jet boats of New Zealand are capable of providing a thrilling ride. We hope this has given our viewers some idea of just what they can do. For us, it's time to turn around and go back 50 kilometres to Westport.
We've come to Launceston in Tasmania because of a request from David Wall of Torrens in the Australian Capital Territory. David writes, when were the most recent traces of the Tasmanian tiger in the form of footprints or sightings found, and do you still believe in their existence? Well, David, we personally haven't seen any Tasmanian tigers, but we're here to speak to an expert at the Queen Victoria Museum in Launceston. Pat and I have arranged to talk to Bob Green, Curator of Zoology at the museum. Bob has some old specimens of the Tasmanian tiger, which was once found all over Australia. The last tiger trapped in Tasmania was back in 1922. Bob, what makes the tiger so different to a dingo or a dog?
Well, it's not related at all, really, Mike, because it is a marsupial, whereas the dingo is just a dog which has gone wild and established in the feral state. These are much more closely related to kangaroos, of course, than they are to dogs. They have just, it's a case of convergent evolution, as you might say, and they have evolved with features very similar to dogs because they feed in a similar manner. They're carnivorous animals.
What other marsupial features does the tiger have, Bob?
Mike, I think this one has a pouch which is reasonably yes. There's a fair example of the pouch there. Of course, remembering this is an old stuffed animal which is probably deformed somewhat, but that gives an example of the position of the pouch with 4 nipples, and then as the young ones develop, of course, the pouch develops and takes in a greater area of the abdomen. Well, in comparison to the dog, for argument's sake, the feet are one. In the dog, he stands upright on his toes and the pad is developed only around the sole of the foot here, whereas in the Siocene, the pad extends right up here to the heel, and they do at times walk on this part of their foot in the same way as a kangaroo uses the whole of his foot, not just the tip of his toes. The dog only uses the tip of the toes. And of course the tail is very large and strong and the butt like the butt of a kangaroo's tail.
Have you ever seen any signs of live ones around? Such as tracks or anything like that?
I have been shown tracks in mud and dirt and sand. Usually they're fairly knocked about and a bit difficult to get good casts. I haven't had any first-hand experience myself that I can say the thing exists. I just base it on a logical deduction and talking to other people, and I just feel that they do exist, and they're probably on the increase.
Reputedly a sheep killer, the tiger during the 1800s had a government bounty on its head of £1 for each dead animal. It was still unprotected by legislation until 1938. Experts and laymen alike still think the tiger exists somewhere in Tasmania. Bob thinks the northeast is the most likely area, and so does a bushman we met. I'm talking to Pat Dunstan, who's seen the Tasmanian tiger. Pat, when did you see this, or where was it you saw it?
Up on I was on the Muscle Row River up in the Gladstone area in the northeast of the state here.
How long ago was this?
Oh, around approximately 10 years ago it would be.
And you're sure it was the Tasmanian tiger?
Oh yes, definitely. All the stripes, everything.
You know other people that have seen them too?
Well, I've know one or two that have seen them, and I would say they were genuine reports. A chappie lives out near Wynyard, about 10 miles out on the Inglis River there. He saw the tracks in the mud along the river there.
How long ago was this?
Oh, just before Christmas, or possibly 6 months ago.
Well, that's pretty recent, isn't it?
Oh, yes.
Has he seen them there before?
Well, he's told me he's seen them there several times before that, even.
Are the tracks distinctive compared to an ordinary dog?
Oh, yes, different altogether. The track is.
There'd be no mistaking it then?
No mistake, no.
So in your opinion, there are still tigers about?
Oh, yes, I would say so, yes, definitely.
A lot of people believe they are extinct. I have my reservations on this. I think there is every probability that they do still exist, but I think for anybody to try and see one in the wild, they would be taking a very long shot, and sure, the museum would be probably the best place to go.
I think Bob's recommendation to would-be tiger hunters is a good one. The museum can show you in a few minutes what our largest carnivore looked like. Maybe one day someone will photograph or catch one for us all to see again. Let's hope so.
This rugged, inhospitable piece of coastline is among the most feared in the world, or at least it was 100 years ago to the sailors of the old square riggers. They used to sail from the west, having travelled from the Cape of Good Hope in Africa, right across the Great Australian Bight, and they were looking for their first landfall, usually the Cape Otway Lighthouse, which is about 50 kilometres to the east. Many of these ships, though, didn't navigate too well. Their equipment wasn't too good in those days, and they met their doom along this rugged piece of coastline in Victoria. We've come to this weather-torn coast to answer a letter from Mr. Brian Pratt from Dandenong North in Victoria, who would like us to take a look at one of the shipwrecks along the coast. He says everyone seems to love a shipwreck, especially with Australia having such dependence on the sea in years gone by. There are numerous wrecks along this coast, some very tragic, and others not so tragic. And then he goes on to say that maritime museums are attracting some attention to themselves by rebuilding old hulks, and with their requests for authentic artefacts to add to their displays.
Mr. Pratt, we're going to take a look at both these aspects raised in your letter. But firstly, the shipwreck. We're going to take a look at the wreck of the Loch Ard, a ship which met its fate when it ran into Muttonbird Island on the 1st of June 1878. And that's only, Muttonbird Island that is only just a few hundred metres from where I'm standing.
Muttonbird Island, just near Port Campbell on the south coast of Victoria, forms part of a spectacular coastline known throughout the world for its grandeur. A windswept coastline that is the graveyard of many fine ships. The south end of the island is where the Loch Ard was wrecked. Approaching the Australian coast after 92 days sailing from England, the 51 passengers and crew celebrated with a farewell party in the evening. Among the passengers, the Carmichael family migrating to Australia. Then at 3 a.m, a heavy fog cleared to reveal high, rugged cliffs dashed by roaring seas. Almost immediately, the Loch Ard was at the mercy of the angry sea. Showered by falling debris, the crew attempted to launch a lifeboat, but before any passengers could get on board, the ship sank, capsizing the boat. Trapped under the lifeboat with a pocket of air, one of the crew, Tom Pearce, drifted from the island towards a gorge opening, where he emerged and clung to the lifeboat.
Young Tom Pearce, completely exhausted, managed to find his way to this small beach, and to do that he had to swim somehow through that narrow gorge behind me. And remember, this was night time and there was a raging storm. He managed to get ashore. He rested for a short period in a cave at the other end of the beach, and then he came back on the beach to see if he could hear for any other survivors. And what he heard was a voice, a female voice, crying out from way out in the ocean. And so he swam out through the raging storm and managed to find Eva Carmichael, who was clinging to a spar.
In spite of the risk of being crushed by large amounts of wreckage, which were filling the gorge by now, Tom Pearce struggled for a long time, helping Eva Carmichael to the beach.
And so he took her to another cave, which he then found at the other end of the beach there. And there he rested for a little while. He made a bed of leaves and bits of growth that he managed to pull out, and just something to lie her on. She was only dressed in a nightie, and quite cold, of course. He came back on the beach, and amongst the wreckage, he found a carton of brandy. Now, he opened one of the bottles of brandy and drank half of it himself, took the rest of it in, rubbed Eva's body down with the brandy, gave her the rest of it to drink, and together they fell asleep in the cave.
The next day, they awoke and realised that they were in this box canyon and had to find some way out. Although he was almost exhausted, Tom found a spot to climb the difficult cliff and struggled up the 30-metre gorge, only to be confronted with another problem. In all directions, the country was a wilderness, a land without landmarks, and no idea which would be the best direction to walk for help. He staggered aimlessly westward. The ground was featureless and covered with sharp, spiky scrub. His mind must have been tormented by the fact that Miss Carmichael was in a weak state and would almost certainly die without help. He had searched for other survivors, and as far as he knew, they could be the only two people anywhere on this inhospitable coast. He came to a blowhole, a good landmark for the return journey. Then plodded on, still heading west. Fortune was with him. He found a fence and a track, which he started to follow, but soon met two men from Glenamble Station mustering sheep. He gasped out his story and returned to the gorge while the two men rode for help. Mr. Gibson, the property owner, mounted a rescue expedition and returned to the gorge, where they had the greatest difficulty raising the weakened Miss Carmichael up the cliff. She was taken to Glenamble Homestead, where she recovered from her ordeal. There were no other survivors, but bodies were floating amongst the wreckage for weeks, as the coast was too rugged to rescue them. A few bodies were eventually hauled ashore and buried at the top of the cliff overlooking the gorge. Eva Carmichael had suffered the loss of her entire family and became the object of much publicity, along with the hero of the Loch Ard, Tom Pearce. He became the recipient of the first gold medal issued by the Humane Society of Victoria. Today, the gorge where this tragedy occurred bears the name Loch Ard, and thousands of visitors come every year to gaze upon this deceptively tranquil spot. The cave at the eastern end of the gorge is known as Tom Pearce's Cave, whilst the 60-metre deep cave at the western end, where the two survivors sheltered, is known as Eva Carmichael's Cave. The headstones in the small graveyard on the top of the cliff tell their own story. The shock of Eva Carmichael's terrible loss made headlines in the newspapers all over the world, and the heroic rescue by Tom Pearce became glamorised by many writers, claiming that the couple married, but they never saw each other again after parting in Melbourne soon after the tragedy. One of the few articles of value salvaged from the cargo of the Loch Ard is this life-sized peacock. Brightly painted and highly glazed, the peacock is one of 5 which were produced by the famous Minton Potteries in England, and it was intended for display at the Melbourne exhibition in 1880. For 50 years it was kept in the hall of the salvager. Its whereabouts was a mystery from 1937 until 1975, when it turned up in Melbourne and was purchased by the Warrnambool Maritime Museum for $4,500. The money was contributed by the people of Warrnambool. It's now on display to all who visit the museum, which brings us to the second part of Mr. Pratt's letter. Here at Warrnambool, a tribute is being paid to the men and women who lived in the age of sail, and that tribute takes the form of a recreation of an entire seaport. And part of that old-time port, when it's complete, will be this building, which was originally the lightkeeper's residence here. But to tell us a little bit more about the objectives of the Maritime Village, we have Peter Ronald, who's the assistant curator. Peter, what are the real objects of the place here?
What we're trying to do, Mel, is to give people an idea of what life was like in the early port of Warrnambool and how dependent the people who lived in the port, how dependent they were on shipping in the period.
And what are you going to call the place?
Its official title is Flagstaff Hill Port of Warrnambool.
Port of Warrnambool.
Port of Warrnambool.
I see. And this lighthouse here, that actually functions, doesn't it?
That's right, it's still operational and has been on its present site since 1872. It's quite a bit older than that. It was built originally on Middle Island, down near the breakwater, and was shifted here in 1872.
Being built around two functional lighthouses, the maritime village will represent a living memorial to the pioneers of the sea. At this stage, there is a lot of work to complete, but already people can come and see old-style craftsmen in a working town typical to the many seaports which existed along the Australian coast 100 years ago.
Go half there on that rudder post, will you?
The centrepiece of the whole place will be a fully reconditioned sailing ship, a speculant. The restoration work is being carried out by craftsmen practising the shipwright's art in the same way as it was in any active shipping port last century. The average man's desire to recapture his pioneering past will be met by this ambitious project when it's complete. Every plank and every timber is being examined, and if need be, it will be replaced before the ship is ready. The work will take a long time, but as soon as the hull is finished, it will be the centre of an artificial port, and visitors will be able to go on board and see all over the ship.
Sort of moved about that one, left with any luck. That seems to be where we find it.
The distinctive sound of the adze and the hammer will echo through this old hull for a long time yet. But the sight of working craftsmen, like the shipwrights, will be part of the fascination to the visitor. The Flagstaff Hill Port of Warrnambool village will not only tell of early maritime life, but provide some of the history of Warrnambool itself, clinging to the rugged coast, which has such a colourful past. Our thanks go to Mr. Brian Pratt in Dandenong for asking us to take a look at ships and shipwrecks on one of Australia's most interesting regions, the awesome beauty of the hostile coast, which has claimed so many ships, and the perpendicular cliffs pitted by the eternal sea.
Travel all over the countryside, ask the Leylands, ask the Leylands. Travel all over the countryside, ask the Leyland Brothers. Whatever it is that you want to see, ask the Leylands, ask the Leylands. No matter whatever that happens to be, ask the Leyland Brothers.